Well, good afternoon. Between 1975 and 1995, my home country of Peru survived under an internal conflict, almost like a civil war, even though it wasn't technically called a civil war. But that conflict took the lives of about 70,000 people, and it's still part of the memory, the history of my home country. It didn't affect anybody in my family, but it's part of the history of our nation. I graduated from high school on December 15 of 1996 because the school year goes from March till December. That's in the Southern Hemisphere. So right before Christmas, that's when I graduated. And that was a year after the peace had been declared. So those were peaceful times, so we thought. I was getting ready because soon I had to go to seminary because my new life was about to start. But 2 days after my graduation, we had a major crisis in my home country, a hostage crisis in Lima. Now, I was not in Lima yet. I was 400 miles away from Lima. But still, it shook the entire nation. So what happened is that there was a big party at the house of the ambassador of Japan to Peru. And in this party, there were about 700 people invited. So it was a big event where the cream of the crop of the Lima society of the time were together. Congressmen, economists, university professors, bankers, ambassadors, all the elite of Lima were gathered. And 14 heavily armed terrorists took over that party, that mansion, and they held hostage all these people. And the negotiations for the release of other terrorists that were in prison started at that particular moment. So that was a very tragic moment. But of course, if you have 14 heavily armed terrorists, but 700 hostages is a lot of people. So it's very hard to contain such a large number of people. So on the 22nd of December, the terrorists started to release several of the hostages, the less important ones or the ones that were less threatening to them. So they started to release the elderly, they started to release the women, there were some children there, they were released too, the men who did not have a political office, and among them there was a priest, Father Juan Julio Vict. He was a Jesuit priest, and so they told him, go. And he said to the terrorists, I am a priest. Can I stay? And they allowed him to stay with the hostages. Finally, the terrorists released so many that they only kept about 71 other hostages, plus the priest and the 14 terrorists in this big mansion in Lima. Little did Father Juan Julio know that he was signing up for 4 long months of captivity, in a total of 126 days to be exact. He had no idea. Now, I entered seminary on March 16 of the next year, 1997. I didn't know this at the time, but my seminary was only 20 blocks away from the place where these terrorists were keeping the hostages. So that meant that when I moved to the seminary, I had to be closer to this place of the crisis. And this was shown everywhere on public TV. Everybody was aware of this. It was a very intense time, to say the least. So when I entered seminary, the crisis still continued and the negotiations still were taking place. Finally, on April 22nd, a month after I entered seminary, the hostage crisis ended via a military intervention. It was really an unbelievable rescue operation. The Peruvian army gathered the best 140 men from the intelligence service of the country, and they intervened the residents. And of course, they killed the 14 terrorists. 3 hostages died, but they were able to rescue 69 of the hostages. They were rescued alive. They came out alive. And among them, Father Juan Julio. So that's a 95% success of the rescue operation, because they pretty much saved every hostage. This was all on TV. And for me, it was just a few blocks away from the seminary where I was living. A few weeks later, Father Juan Julio came to the school where I was studying theology, philosophy, and he came to talk to us, seminarians, nuns, and other students. And he talked to us about his experience of being inside that residence for those long 4 months, and what he did there with all of them as he was kept hostage inside. So he said, obviously, there was a very difficult climate, because obviously everybody was fearing for their lives. There were plenty of weapons inside. But he was inside, and he was a priest, so he was able to negotiate with the terrorists to say Mass. I am a priest, so I should say Mass, but how do I say Mass if I don't have hosts and wine? So when food was being brought inside the house of this hostage place, also bread and wine for the Eucharist were brought in. Eventually, Bibles were brought in. Eventually, rosaries were brought in. These were all part of the negotiations. And Father says that he would celebrate daily Mass there inside that place. And the terrorists were kind enough to allow them to celebrate Mass every day. Then he said that when you're held hostage, you have a lot of time in your hands, he said. And so there is not much to do, except to be afraid for your life. So you might as well occupy your time doing something. So he started doing Bible study with the hostages and with the terrorists because they had to guard them, right? And so with the Bibles that were brought in, he was doing Bible study inside that house or that residence. Then the rosaries came in. And so one day he said after Mass, he will bless the rosaries and will give the rosary to each of the hostages. And they like to put the rosaries on their necks, like a necklace type of thing. So they were all lined up like in a communion line, and he will impose the rosary on everybody's head. And then he noticed that the terrorists were also lining up to get the rosary. So what do you do, right? And so he said, well, I guess they want a rosary too, right? And if I don't do it, probably this is my end. So he would also impose the rosary on the head of the terrorists. And he said that the rosary will go on top of all their bullets and their grenades and everything that they had on their chest. When the crisis ended, all of this was on TV. And when it was on TV, it was portrayed as a great success, because indeed it was. And every time they talk about this success, they said, we only had 3 casualties. But every time that Father was interviewed, he always said, 17 Peruvians died. He never said 3 casualties. He said 17 Peruvians died. Because he always took into consideration the 14 terrorists, because they were Peruvians too, and so they are human beings too. And they most likely were Christians too, because in Peru everybody pretty much is Catholic. He would say things like, I grieve for the families of these terrorists, because these armed men were brainwashed by communists and by socialist agendas, ideologies that ultimately led them into violence. Well, Jesus also died for them, for their salvation. So he was grieving for them and for their families. I cannot remember some of the things that he told us. He said, during the hostage crisis, Jesus gave me the opportunity to love my enemy. To love my enemy not tomorrow, not yesterday, but the enemy that was right in front of me. An enemy that could pop a grenade on the spot and the two of us would cease to exist on the moment. But I had to love my enemy at that particular moment, and I can tell you it was hard, he used to say to us. Then he said something like, giving them the rosaries perhaps was my way to turn to them the other cheek, like the gospel says, because they chose the way of violence, but I choose the way of the cross. And he says that it was very meaningful to him to see that on top of those instruments of violence, the cross of Jesus was on top of it. So, wow. Father Juan Julio died in 2010 with diabetes complications. So he lived about 13 years after the crisis. And he worked tirelessly in the Committee for Peace and Reconciliation that was formed after the ending of our conflict. And he really helped a lot in trying to heal the wounds left by that local conflict. In the first reading of today, the seventh Sunday in Ordinary Time, we hear that David had a golden opportunity to avenge his fate. He was in front of vulnerable King Saul. Saul was sleeping, and Saul had been looking for David to kill him multiple times and in many ways. Now David has a choice. He can take care of the matter with his own hands right now. In this moment, I can take care of it and be done with it. But this is how David thinks. Today, though the Lord delivers Saul into my grasp, I will not harm the Lord's anointed. Thus, David spared the life of King Saul. The first reading teaches us that many times in life we may have to face our enemy face to face. The one who seeks to harm us, we may have to face them. Look at them in the eyes, and the temptation of getting even is so great. The temptation of responding with harm to their harming us. Temptation is great. We may be tempted to act in an instant, but God gives us a chance to think, to make choices, to choose the higher road. I am not going to respond with harm to the one who harms me. The gospel goes a step farther, because Jesus does not teach us simply to avoid harming our enemies. That in itself is okay, but is not sufficient for the kingdom. Our enemies deserve something greater. They deserve love. That's the irony of the gospel. Because Jesus says, to you who hear I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. Turning the other cheek does not mean becoming a doormat, by the way. Turning the other cheek is actually giving us the opportunity to look at the one who is harming us face to face in the process. My enemy may be full of anger, rage, desire for revenge. My enemy may think that they are not deserving of nobody's love and much less of God's love. But when I turn the other cheek, and in the process I have to look at my enemy in the eye, what I am really saying to my enemy is, I love you because Jesus loves you too. And maybe you don't think you are lovable, but you are, because for you too, Jesus came in the flesh. So that image of the rosaries, the rosary that would go on the neck of the terrorists on top of all the bullets and the grenades, that image has always stayed in my head. I don't know why. It's been so long, since 1997. But that image has stuck in my mind. Mount Calvary was a place of violence. And on top of Mount Calvary, the cross of Jesus was planted. And from that cross, Jesus forgave and loved his enemies. I don't know what kind of things come to your mind when you think of your enemies, the enemies of your past, the enemies of your present, whatever that may be. You can still plant the cross of Jesus on top of the harm that has been done to you. It is still possible. It is still possible. The cross of Jesus can go on top of that. With divine help, Jesus can heal the wounds and breathe his forgiveness and his love. The beginning verse of this gospel is key, because this is what Jesus says. To you who hear, I say, love your enemies. Not to somebody else, to you who hear. So we either choose to hear it or not. Amen.